Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access transcripts to our podcasts and our complete newsletter. Again, that's Patreon. patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. The latest word from the IRS is that, contrary to popular belief, churches and other houses of worship can indeed endorse political candidates from the pulpit without threatening their tax-exempt status. When asked to comment on the tax agency's stance, a spokesperson for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints pointed, perhaps tellingly, to the faith's official policy of political neutrality, which states matter-of-factly that the church, quote, does not endorse, promote, or oppose political parties and their platforms or candidates for political office, end quote. But could that change someday? Might the time come when President so-and-so, sporting a red tie, or Apostle such-and-such, donning a blue one, gets up in general conference and urges members to vote for a Republican presidential candidate or a Democrat seeking the White House? Is the IRS position really revolutionary? Could it dramatically alter the delicate balance between the church and state? Will most clergy even want to wade into partisan politics from the pulpit? Here to discuss those questions and more is Sam Brinson, a Latter-day Saint tax law professor at Loyola University Chicago and author of the recently released Between the Temple and the Tax Collector: The Intersection of Mormonism and the State. Sam, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Well, for starters, could you briefly explain the court case in which the IRS made this filing and how it relates to the so-called Johnson Amendment?
Absolutely. So about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, two churches, a religious broadcaster and another religious organization, sued the IRS. And in the lawsuit, they basically said, the Johnson Amendment is unconstitutional. Now, the quick background on the Johnson Amendment, it's named for, at the time, Senator Lyndon Johnson, who proposed it in 1954, and Congress enacted it. And it basically prohibits any organization that's exempt under Section 501c3 from endorsing or opposing candidates for office. So it's a blanket prohibition. Technically, and we'll talk about this more later, but technically, if a tax-exempt organization endorses or opposes a candidate for office, they lose their tax exemption. So these four organizations said this rule is unconstitutional, at least as applied to churches. And they sued, and the government opposed it, and the lawsuit was ongoing. And then about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago, the IRS and these four organizations filed a joint filing with the district court in Texas. And in that joint filing, they said, the IRS basically said, we agree that this is unconstitutional as applied to churches, and we want you, court, to issue a ruling. And in that ruling, we want you to forbid the IRS now or anytime in the future from enforcing the Johnson Amendment against these two churches. One is a particular Baptist church, and the other seems to be a more general church.
And is this lawsuit viable? You know what I mean? What's its...
I do know what you mean. In the first instance, the lawsuit was going to be a loser for the churches. It was going to be a loser, not because it's not right. I've written about this a little bit, and I'm with a growing group of skeptics in the constitutionality of this provision for reasons we can discuss if you want to or not. But whether or not it's constitutional, it's a really, really hard provision to challenge, because under tax law principles, the litigants can't challenge the tax law unless it has been applied against them. So I can't sue and say, IRS, you can't tax me for these reasons. I can only sue after the IRS has imposed a tax. So technically, these churches can't sue until the IRS revokes their tax exemption. So
and they haven't done that.
Which it hasn't done.
Right,
so they
right.
don't have, in the legal world, what we call standing. They don't have the ability to appear in front of the court. So this settlement, the government, if it wanted to oppose this, could have just argued no standing. We haven't done any enforcement. Whether or not this is constitutional, you can't do anything about it. But instead, the Trump administration, the IRS under the Trump administration, decided that they were going to go along with these churches and agree with them.
So back up for a second. Why do you think these churches want the Johnson Amendment gone?
So there are a handful, probably a large handful, but there are a handful of churches that believe either sincerely or insincerely, but they believe that they should be able to endorse candidates from the pulpit or oppose candidates from the pulpit. Some of them believe that because they think that one particular candidate is superior. Perhaps you've got an evangelical church that opposes abortion. They believe that former Vice President Kamala Harris would support abortion, and so they want to preach against her. You might have a black church that is whose membership is democratically aligned that wants to ensure that the local mayor or city council is Democratic. So you've got because they believe either it will help the church or that it will promote the good. You have other churches that just believe in an expansive version of religious liberty. So they believe that they may or may not actually want to oppose candidates, but they want the ability to do it. They don't want to be told what to do. So I've been paying attention to this for maybe the last 20 years. And over the last 20 years, periodically churches, pastors will support or oppose a candidate, sometimes just to do it and sometimes to try and get their exemption revoked so that they can challenge the constitutionality of this provision.
How often has the IRS actually enforced the Johnson Amendment against a church?
So in the 71-year history of the Johnson Amendment, I am aware of one church that lost its tax exemption. The church was called Branch Ministries. It was in the mid-90s, and they took out, I believe, a half-page, but maybe a full-page ad in either the New York Times or USA Today, I don't remember which, but a national newspaper opposing Bill Clinton. And that's the only case that I have been able to find where it has been enforced against a church. It's worth noting that the IRS rarely enforces it against non-church tax-exempt organizations. They did a self-study in the aughts, 2004, 2006, where they figured out of about 100 organizations that violated the Johnson Amendment, half of which were churches and half of which weren't, they revoked no church exemptions, and they revoked either 3 or 4 non-church exemptions.
I mean, I've definitely heard church pastors speaking ill of Mitt Romney. It's a candidate.
Right. So it's an interesting question. This raises a question with churches and actually non-church organizations about when the person is speaking on behalf of the organization. Because a pastor is welcome to dislike Mitt Romney as much as they want. A pastor may hate Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, and they may go to a cocktail party and talk poorly of the candidate. And that probably doesn't implicate their church. We had a question here in Illinois of the CEO of a hospital who appeared in an ad on behalf of a local candidate. And it was an open question. It ultimately was an academic question because the IRS didn't do any enforcement actions. But it was kind of an open question about whether his endorsement represented speech on behalf of the hospital or if it was just his own speech. My take in that case was it was on behalf of the hospital because he appeared in a podium that had the hospital's name, flanked by people in doctor and nurse uniforms. But on the margins, it can be an open question. President Nelson of the LDS Church, I don't know his politics, but he may well be a political person. He may well have a political preference. And in private, he's not necessarily talking on behalf of the LDS Church.
Is there a distinction, Sam, here to be made between what a pastor or bishop or whoever might say over the pulpit offhandedly or just over the pulpit versus an institution taking a formal stance in some way?
So that actually gets into precisely what the IRS is talking about here. My take, and again, there's not a lot of developed law on this because it really hasn't been enforced or challenged or gone to court. But even if it's offhand, if it's in an official capacity, then it violates the Johnson Amendment. So if you go to church on Sunday and your bishop gets up and says, is Utah having any elections right now? Or are
municipal elections?
Municipal elections.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets up and says, the mayoral candidate's a member of our stake and is an excellent person. And I think you should vote for her. I mean, even if it's offhand, that's basically in his official capacity, and that probably violates the Johnson Amendment.
And that's what the IRS is saying would now be okay.
The IRS is now saying that would be okay. It's interesting in this. The IRS is taking actually kind of a narrow view. What they say is, we don't think that in the ordinary course of religious discourse, in the ordinary course of religious meetings, that supporting or opposing a candidate represents an endorsement. So that they're not saying wide open. They're not saying branch ministries would be okay taking out a full page ad in a national newspaper. They're not saying the LDS Church would be okay taking out an ad in the Salt Lake Tribune. What they're saying is, if a bishop gets up and says you should vote for Mitt Romney, or presumably even like in a talking conference, President Oaks gets up and says, y'all should vote for Mitt Romney, who's running again, or whatever it is. If it's in the ordinary course of preaching, in the ordinary course of church business, that would be okay. That wouldn't be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. Now, they don't lay out what they think the borders of that are. Is a church newsletter okay? Probably, but we don't. It is like the Mormon the Tabernacle at Temple Square broadcast. Is that okay? I mean, I don't know. So if this goes into effect, if this becomes official IRS policy, there are still plenty of open questions. But your bishop gets up and says something in sacrament meeting. The president of the church gets up and says something in general conference. A rabbi says something at synagogue. Priest endorses a candidate during mass. That all would probably be just fine under this.
One Catholic priest I was talking to said, in the filing, it says it's no different than a conversation among family members. Remember that part of it?
Yes.
And he said, yeah, but in today's world, a lot of churches stream their services online. So the audience is much bigger than just a conversation among the members of that church. And, think about LDS General Conference, that goes out to literally millions of people. So that analogy about it's just a conversation among family members kind of doesn't work in today's world.
It doesn't. And it also represents, in my mind, a very low church Protestant view of religion. I mean, you have religions, an Eastern Orthodox religion. I actually haven't been to Eastern Orthodox services, but my wife has been to a wedding, and it strikes me as very much less a conversation like you might have in a low church Protestant community, and more communication from an authority to hearers.
Okay, so let's talk about the LDS Church and its tax exemption. It seems like that has been a big thing for the church. And how has it worked to preserve its tax exemption? Obviously, it would cost the church a lot to lose its exemption. Financially, it would cost.
Right. Financially, and I think in other ways too. The tax exemption isn't meant to be a stamp of approval, but we take it as a stamp of approval. The church views it to at least some extent as a stamp of approval, we are a legitimate organization. So even if technically it doesn't mean anything like that, there is that feeling. And the church, since early days, has cared immensely about its tax exemption, sometimes for financial reasons. Do you mind if I mention my book really quickly?
No, please do.
Awesome. So I've got a chapter in the book that looks at the first meeting house that was built in New York. In New York City, it was built in Brooklyn in 1919. And they go along, they build the building, then they get a tax bill from the local property tax collector saying, you owe property tax on this. And the church kind of, the freaks out might be an overstatement, but it might not be an overstatement. They say, but we are a religious organization and there is a property tax exemption for religious organizations. And the tax assessor says, yeah, but only for non-foreign, which means incorporated in the state of New York. And so that proceeds, and the mission president of the Eastern States Mission writes to the first presidency and says, hey, this is going to cost us like, I think $800 this year, and that amount's only going to go up. This is real money. We need to do something, and we can do one of many things. We can incorporate the Eastern States Mission as a New York corporation, or alternatively, we can transfer the property to trustees, one of whom must live in New York, or we can do another couple things. And this is at the same time that the church is really starting to consolidate its various corporate organizations under just a Salt Lake corporation. So they try out a couple things, but eventually what they do is they form a New York corporation to preserve the property tax exemption. And that by the 1930s, the New York courts reverse that rule and they say, no, any church can qualify for the property tax exemption. But the church keeps that corporation until about the 1950s, maybe the early 1960s. More recently, the church does a couple things. One thing that the church does is, if you look at the handbook of instructions, it is very, very explicit about use of meeting houses. And it says you can't use our meeting houses for political events, for anything related to voting, unless like there's very specific, like there's no other location that works. You can't use our meeting houses for anything potentially for profit because we don't want to lose our tax exemption. So the church has set up a number of rules limiting how we can use meeting houses and how we can use meetings to ensure that it doesn't accidentally lose its tax exemption. And this potentially is a big deal because the LDS Church is basically one large corporate entity, where a lot of churches, the corporate level is at a much, there's an umbrella religious corporation, but local meeting houses, local parishes are smaller. I think that the Catholic Church is incorporated at, I think it's above the parish level, but I think that it is at maybe the diocese level or the archdiocese level. I worked once with a Presbyterian church that has an overarching thing, but then each area has its separate corporation. So for a religious organization organized like that, if the Chicago diocese loses its tax exemption, that's bad. That's not great, but that doesn't affect the diocese of California or Utah or New York or anywhere else. The LDS Church, if my bishop, who's a good person if he's listening, but if somehow he slipped up, endorsed a candidate, got the exemption revoked, that would be the whole church. That wouldn't just be Chicago.
Mormon Land will be right back.
Can I ask you, you blogged about this before, about when Donald Trump was running for a second term, for another term, that the church, on moral grounds, could ask its members not to vote for Donald Trump. Now, you said he operated no illusion that all Latter-day Saints would follow that instruction, but that if the church did that, it wouldn't face any punishment from the IRS. Is that kind of because the Johnson Amendment hasn't really been applied to churches very often or frequently?
So that would be, yes, that would be a normative, not a legal statement. Okay. The church legally could lose its exemption. As a practical matter, it would face it would have faced very little risk of losing its exemption. I should also say I am a tax attorney and a tax law professor. But one of the important things I try to communicate to my students is tax isn't the end all be all of things. It pains me sometimes to say that because it is what I do. But organizations, including religious organizations, need to look at taxes as one part in their overall goals. If they have a moral religious commitment that's incompatible with the best case for taxes, then they have to make the decision. Do they prioritize taxes? Do they prioritize this other thing that is a moral imperative?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you think this new filing will compel the church or give them license to abandon its political neutrality policy?
I love questions where I can come up with 3 different answers. And this is one of them. So in the first instance, no. If the court ends up issuing this ruling that the IRS has asked for, it literally only applies to the 2 churches that are plaintiffs.
Right.
So in the first instance, what it does is it says the IRS, the current IRS and no future IRS will be able to enforce the Johnson Amendment against these 2 churches. And that's important. And this is the reason they want this in writing issued by a judge. Because if it's just an agreement between the churches and the IRS can change its mind. It's not bound going forward. So there's a 3-year statute of limitations. So presumably in a little more than 3 years, but say in a year from now, if a church that isn't one of these churches, if the LDS Church endorses a candidate and the IRS has a policy of not revoking exemptions for that, under the next presidential administration, they may change that. They can go back 3 years. They can retroactively revoke an exemption. So this ruling, if it actually becomes a ruling, only technically protects those 2 churches. So if you're risk averse, if you're small c conservative, you're not going to rely on this. The LDS Church is definitely risk averse. And whether you think it is politically conservative, it is like the small c non-politically conservative. If I were advising a church, I would say don't rely on this as a legal matter. So that is step 1. Step 2 of this is this ruling, other than giving absolute certainty to these 2 churches, really doesn't change much. We've talked about this already, but the IRS doesn't enforce this. So if you wanted to, if you had the desire as a church to endorse a candidate, this doesn't really substantively change your risk of losing your tax exemption. But the third thing is, on a normative level, this does, at least on the margins, change things. Because even though I've said the IRS has basically never enforced this against churches, the IRS has also never said it is our policy not to enforce this against churches. So that represents a rhetorical change. To some extent, then, it gives permission to churches that want to endorse candidates to endorse those candidates. It doesn't change their risk factor. It doesn't change the law, but it does say we really explicitly think that this is okay. We're the enforcement agency. So if you want to do it and you were worried about doing it because you didn't want to break the law, we're telling you that that's not the law.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a 2-pronged question now.
Awesome.
One of them is, do you think the church, if this follows through, if the IRS follows through in all this, do you think the church someday will endorse candidates? And secondly, do you think that a church should endorse candidates?
Great questions. To the first one, I really don't think it will. It hasn't always been this way. We know that in the 19th century, even in the early 20th century, it would endorse candidates. And through at least the 50s, church leaders would maybe not endorse, but they would at least strongly hint at it in a way that church leaders mostly haven't done during my lifetime. So I don't see that changing because I don't see that changing now because kind of in the move for respectability, a respectable church in large US society, at least, doesn't endorse candidates. So that would be the first one. I don't see that as a change. And I just said I love two-pronged questions, and I forgot the second prong.
Do you think it should?
Oh, do I think it should? I do not think that it should. And I don't think that it except maybe in really rare exceptional circumstances. You outed me, but I've outed myself on my blog. I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I think that personally that he represents an existential threat to rule of law and to democracy. But while I would not have preferred Mitt Romney myself, I wouldn't see him as an existential threat. I wouldn't see his candidacy as something that justifies or George W. Bush or Jeb Bush or your standard pre-2016 Republican. I may not agree with them. I may not vote for them, but I wouldn't view them as the type of existential threat that creates an exception. So let's take out the potential existential threat. Let's take out the vast exception. I think that endorsing candidates comes with a couple significant risks. One of those risks is alienating members of the church. The LDS Church members, at least in the US, tend to be politically conservative. But my understanding is there are at least 20-ish% who tend to vote for Democrats. I'm sure that those 20% aren't evenly distributed, but I would be shocked to discover that there are wards in the church where there aren't at least a couple Democrats. So the bishop gets up and says, you should vote for Trump. That wouldn't be something that I would want to hear at church. And the flip side is bishop gets up and says, you should vote for Harris. I have a lot of co-congregants who wouldn't love to hear that. So on the one hand, unless you're a super homogeneous church, the LDS Church is relatively homogeneous politically in the US. There may be some that are more, but even with that, it's going to be alienating to at least some congregants. But I think more critically and structurally, one thing we're seeing is that constitutional protections largely depend on the willingness of the people and politicians to enforce them. We're in a world where fewer and fewer people identify with a particular religion. It's still a majority of Americans, but it's a significantly smaller majority than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So to the extent that we want to keep and maintain the religious liberty that we have in the US, and I personally think that it is important. I may view it slightly differently from President Oakes, but I agree with him that religious liberty, the constitutional separation of church and state and free exercise provisions are important. But the more that people see religion as not something special, not something unique, but just another political actor, the less likely I think they would be to acknowledge that there are special rules and privileges that should be granted to religions and to religious organizations. So I feel like endorsing candidates, because there's a broad public opposition to this, that undercuts the religious liberty that might give churches permission to do this.
Even if the church stopped short of endorsing candidates, might a shift in this from the IRS embolden churches or religious leaders to speak out more forcefully on some issues? Not fearing that they would cross that line, you know?
Right. It could. I feel like most churches and religious leaders who want to endorse candidates are already doing it, and maybe this will let them do it more. And I am sure that I'm wrong on the margins. I'm sure that there is a church where the pastor would love to do it, but really doesn't want to get in trouble with the IRS. And that pastor might move over to the other side of the line. But I'd be surprised if they're a vast number. I should have looked it up. I should have it on my screen in front of me, but I don't. But there have been a couple religious umbrella groups who are opposed to this ruling, in part because I think they want to. The advantage to the Johnson Amendment is it gives an excuse to a religious organization that doesn't want to endorse candidates. If a congregant, if a politician comes to them and says, you really should endorse this person, they can say, hey, I would love to. That would be wonderful, but.
Last question. Are there bigger issues the church faces when it comes to tax law?
Right now, in the US, that's a really good and a hard question. I appreciate it. I don't see a lot of super pressing questions. There are some questions floating around in light of Nielsen's whistleblower stuff and in light of the SEC fine about whether the church's tax filings have been entirely accurate and entirely right. And one of the hard things about that is people think of tax law as being a black and white, easy yes, no answer. And it turns out that that would be no fun. I wouldn't enjoy my job if it were like that. And I do enjoy my job. There are questions and shades. The church does hire good accounting firms. So I suspect that it's at least within the realm of the acceptable. There's, call it like a 20% window that works, and I suspect that it falls in that window. There are always open questions about property tax obligations, and I think the church is usually pretty well advised and pretty well organized on those questions. There are potentially, actually, now that I think of it, wow, that was a long time for me to come up with an answer, but there is potentially one or two significant issues, and they are brand new. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act makes a number of changes to the tax law. And I haven't read it intricately because honestly, I was camping when it was signed. But it makes a couple changes to charitable donations. One change, it makes three that might be relevant to the church. One change is beneficial to the church. Traditionally, can only deduct your charitable donations if you itemize. Itemize means that you take itemized deductions. And basically, if you're married filing a joint return, you can either take an automatic $30,000 deduction, or if you have itemized deductions in excess of that, you can itemize. The big itemized deductions are home mortgage interest, state and local taxes, and charitable deductions. So for members of the church who don't have more than $30,000 of those things, they're not getting any tax benefit for their charitable donations. But the One Big Beautiful Bill Act provides a non-itemized deduction of, I believe, up to, I want to say it's $1,000, but it might just be $600 for non-itemizers for charitable deductions. So only about 10% of Americans itemize. If church members are on average slightly wealthier than your median American, maybe it's 15% of LDS church members. We don't have numbers for that. But that, I mean, even if 20% of church members itemize, that means 80% of church members aren't getting a tax benefit. I need a tax benefit. We're not talking religious spiritual benefits. Aren't getting a tax benefit for the tithing that they pay. But this new act, if I'm right about the $1,000, it means that they can deduct up to $1,000 of their tithes, even if they don't itemize.
Even taking the standard,
even if they take the standard deduction, they get the $30,000 ish. It's adjusted for inflation, but it's in that range. Standard deduction plus up to $1,000 of a deduction. For those who itemize, though, there is a shift that is disadvantageous, which is you can only take charitable deductions to the extent they exceed 0.5% of your adjusted gross income. And now that I say that, I have to do math. And the math is, if you earn $100,000, 1% is $1,000. So 0.5% is $500. So if I pay $100,000, that means I'm paying $10,000 in tithing. It means that I get a $9,500 deduction, but I can't deduct that first $500. That doesn't sound like a ton, and it's not really a ton, but as your income goes up, it becomes a bigger initial floor. So that potentially, I don't know how much that reduces tithing, but that affects wealthier members' ability to deduct their tithing. Whether you think that's good or bad, it is a thing. The other thing is it puts that similar kind of floor, but at 1% for corporate donations to charitable organizations, which doesn't seem maybe like a big deal, except that the numbers I've seen suggest that few corporations donate more than 1% of their income. I don't know how much the church gets in corporate donations. It may not get anything. It may be a small amount. It may be a large amount. But it represents a substantive change. It doesn't just affect the LDS Church. It affects 501c3 organizations throughout the US. But those two things, the above the line non-itemized deduction for charitable donations is beneficial to members of the church and potentially to the church if it makes members more able to afford their tithing. The other two are bad for donors and potentially could reduce donations that the church receives.
Sam, we'll have to have you back on around April 15th, okay?
I would love to.
Okay. The name of the book again is Between the Temple and the Tax Collector, The Intersection of Mormonism and the State. Sam Brenson, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind all of our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.